Hi again. In this module, we're going to discuss the problem of free will. This is a deep and complicated issue, and there's quite a few things that we're going to need to discuss. So what I want to do now is go over some of these issues that we're going to need to think about. First, we're going to need to think about what exactly we mean by free will. What does this word refer to? And how is free will related to moral responsibility? Moral responsibility turns out to be a really crucial element and some of the complications that we're going to consider. And when we're thinking about moral responsibility, this introduces the problem of whether or not we could do otherwise, which is also closely related to the problem of free will. So what does it mean when we say that someone could have done otherwise? And what does it mean to say that you could choose something different? And this brings up some of the terminology that we'll consider. Is free will compatible with determinism? This is an issue of compatibilism versus incompatibilism, right? So there's different versions of incompatibilism. One is the view called hard determinism. Another is a view called libertarianism. And then compatibilism itself is a view that says free will, in fact, is compatible with determinism. So these are some of the basic things that we're going to think about as we proceed. Now, in order to get a better grip on our topic, let's just talk a little bit about what exactly we mean by free will. On the one hand, there's what we might call theological views of free will and determinism. And these are views that are closely related with different religious notions about God, whether God gives people free will. So for instance, in Genesis, in the Bible, the book of Genesis has a story where Adam and Eve eat from the tree of forbidden knowledge. And this is because God gives them free choice to be able to choose whether to sin or not sin. And this introduces evil and all sorts of problems into the world. Yet at the same point, the Bible often talks about God predestining us. Some are predestined to go to heaven, maybe some are predestined to go to hell. Nonetheless, the Bible does say quite a bit about predestination. Now, these are different views that are closely related to what we're going to be talking about, but we are not specifically going to focus here on theological views of free will and determinism, though they are definitely closely associated. So then what views of free will do I have in mind? Well, I'm thinking of ordinary examples. For instance, when I teach this class in person, I usually talk about whatever shirt I'm wearing. So, today I'm wearing a black shirt, but it seems plausible that I could have worn a blue shirt or a red shirt. I have a blue shirt in my closet and a red shirt or a gray shirt. I could have chosen to wear some other shirt, but I wore the black shirt. So this seems to be an example of something that I could have done different. I could have chosen to do some other thing, namely what shirt I'm wearing now. I could have chosen a different one, right? Presumably, you could have done lots of different things today, different than you actually chose, right? So right now you're watching this video. It seems plausible to suggest that you could have waited an hour before you started watching this video. Or maybe you could have watched the video yesterday. These are different choices that you could have made that are different from the choices that you actually made. Likewise, I could have chosen to wait a day or two to record this video. That's something I could have done. It seems very plausible to think this, right? It seems true. But if it's the case that we could not have done otherwise, then I must have worn the black shirt today. You must have chosen to watch this video right now, and I could not have waited to make the video. And so we can use these kind of ordinary examples to, generalize to basically everything that we choose to do. Free will, we generally think, means that we could do whatever we want to do, right? So these are kind of ordinary examples. But there's also what we might call social political examples, where we think that different governments should give us a certain amount of flexibility with what we choose to do. So in the United States, we think that the government should not step in and take away different options from us. Right. So if I want to choose to go to work as a McDonald's worker, or if I want to go to work as an employee of Target, I should be able to choose to do those things. The government shouldn't force me to do one or the other. So these are kind of ordinary social political examples of having some sort of freedom. And generally we can think of this as saying we have the freedom to do whatever we want to do, right? This is a very basic notion. I could wake up at noon, or I could wake up at 5 in the morning. That's up to me. So I have a certain kind of autonomy, is the way philosophers sort of put this sometimes. This principle or notion of autonomy means that I govern my own choices. I'm in charge of my life narrative. I choose what happens to me and my body. This kind of a basic way of thinking about the principle of autonomy. And it's also associated with rights. I have certain rights to do different things with my life. Maybe we could talk about this in terms of having right to a freedom of speech or freedom of expression. I have a right to, to be autonomous in these sorts of ways. Again, these are all kind of grouped together in socio-political examples, or sort of ordinary examples, as I mentioned a moment ago. And there's also a technical term, modality, that philosophers often use, which talks about the logic of necessity and possibility, right? So when we're doing different proofs, sometimes we introduce these notions because you might think that some particular statement, maybe a logical claim of some sort, maybe we think that it's necessarily true, meaning it could not be false. And we might also say, well, in some situations, some claim or some truth might be true. In other situations, it might be false. So we might think of hypothetical, like, possible worlds where something is true and maybe some other statement is false. So this is a way of thinking about how possibility and necessity is related to free will and determinism, as it's tied up in different logical principles. So that's all fine and good, but why should we care about any of this? Why should I care about whether I have free will or not? Why should you really care? The short answer, I think most people will say, is because of praise and blame. And this is going to tie into the principle of alternative possibilities. It looks like in order to praise somebody or to blame them for whatever they do, then it has to be the case that they could have done something different, right? So we tend to care about holding people morally responsible for the things they do. And it also seems as though in order to hold someone morally responsible, they could have chosen not to do that thing, right? So it would then be wrong to blame or punish somebody for doing whatever it is they did if they couldn't do otherwise, if they were forced to do it. Take, for instance, if somebody puts a gun to my head and tells me, I want you to go rob the bank, well, of course, I'm going to go rob the bank. I wouldn't normally rob the bank. That's not something I would choose to do, in my daily go of things. But if somebody puts a gun to my head and forces me to, if they coerce me in this way, well, then sure, I'm going to do it because I don't want to die. So you might think that if someone is forcing me to rob the bank, you're not going to hold me morally responsible for that action because I didn't really have any other choice. It was something that I was being coerced into doing. Right. So it seems wrong to blame someone for what they do if they couldn't have chosen something different. Now, you might say, but you still could choose not to rob the bank. But under these conditions, that would mean that I would lose my life. And that seems like my options are severely limited, to say the very least. Right. So this is what we kind of mean by having alternative possibilities available to you. I've got this nice little image here of somebody who's looking at a fork in the road. They could choose option A or B, but if they choose option B and we hold them morally responsible for that, if they're going to be praised or blamed, then that means that they could have chosen the other option, option A, right, going down the other road. So that's kind of the general way of thinking about this principle, but let's look at what the principle says in a little more detail to kind of clear up exactly what it says. This is going to be really crucial for some of the other things we need to go through for this module. All right, so the principle of alternative possibilities says Smith, or some person, some subject, I'm just going to use the dummy word Smith here. Smith is morally responsible for X, where X is going to be any action whatsoever. Smith is morally responsible for X only if Smith could have chosen to do something other than X, right? Smith could choose option A or B, one or the other. Equivalently, we could say Smith is morally responsible for X only if it is possible that Smith could have done otherwise. As Nagel puts it in this chapter, no ifs or about it, right? There's no sort of like a hypothetical possible world where you actually do otherwise, right? All right, so this is going to be the same for praising somebody. So it's not only when we hold somebody morally accountable for their actions, but it's also going to be the case when we praise them for their actions. So to kind of illustrate this point, if you take an exam and you fail the exam, we're going to hold you morally accountable for that by giving you a failing grade. But this seems to assume that you could have done better, right? It seems to assume that you could have studied more, or you could have, paid more attention in class. But if it's the case that you just don't have the cognitive ability to excel or to do well enough in that particular class or on that exam, right, for whatever reasons, maybe if you're a 3-year-old and you're taking calculus, well, your cognitive abilities haven't gotten to the point where you could actually pass the exam, and so we wouldn't hold you morally accountable because your cognitive abilities didn't allow you to do that. But assuming that you do have the cognitive abilities to pass the exam and you were just lazy and decided not to take the exam or not to study for the exam, in that situation, we would give you the failing grade. Likewise, if you write a really great paper for me and I put an A+ on it and I say, this is a really nice job, I enjoyed reading the paper, so I'm giving you some praise, I'm assuming that you could have just blown it off. You could have decided to, I'm not going to give a fuck and I'm not going to do anything for this paper, right? But it's because you put a lot of effort into it, you paid a lot of attention in class, and you worked really hard on the paper. That's why I'm praising you for it. So this all assumes that you could do something different, right? So if Smith could not have done other than X, then Smith is not morally responsible for doing that action. So if we were to put that in terms of making some kind of a choice, what we would say then is if Smith could not have chosen anything different from X, then Smith is not morally responsible for X. Now, the reason why this principle turns out to be really important is because it tells us something about the relationship between free will and determinism. If determinism is true, then you could not have done otherwise, right? So if determinism is true, it turns out that the principle of alternative possibilities is false. You only have one possible choice, right? You don't have an option between A and B as we intuitively think we do. If determinism is true, you only have one option, option A. Option B is only an illusion. And we'll say more about why that's the case here in a minute. But it looks like if we don't have this ability to choose otherwise, then we're not going to be able to hold people morally accountable for what they do. We can't praise them or blame them. So in a nutshell, that's kind of the basic point, the basic idea. It seems as if, intuitively speaking at least, we can only hold you morally responsible for what it is that you do if you could have done otherwise, right? That's what the principle of alternative possibilities really says, right? So moral responsibility requires the principle of alternative possibilities is true. So if that principle is false, then we can't hold you responsible. We can't praise or blame you for what you do. If determinism is true, then it's not clear how we could do any of that. So then how is it that we could both accept that determinism is true, assuming that we have good reason to think that it's true? How can we both accept that determinism is true and hold people morally responsible for their actions? That's kind of the issue. That's the problem at its very core. So then what reasons do we have to think that determinism, in fact, is true? Now, I think it's going to be helpful to look at mass shootings in the United States. This might seem somewhat sadistic, but just hear me out here. All right, so thinking about gun violence and mass murders is illuminating because in each of these cases, we assume that the shooter did not have to do what they did. They could have done something different, right? So that's one basic point. And in each of these cases, I think it's really interesting because we often ask this very simple question. Why did they do it? Why did this happen? Right? And this is true not just for mass murders, but for other things too, like natural disasters, hurricanes, floods, and so forth, right? We generally want to know, why did they do it? Why did this happen? But we might wonder what other factors might be involved with the reason for why they did what they did. And that's because we think maybe there could be factors that we haven't thought about that turn out to be out of their control. Factors that are not in the person's control that actually contributed to the terrible thing they decided to do. So, for instance, we might wonder about their home life. What is that like? What sort of parents do they have? Have they been neglected in some way? Do they have a proper education? I remember back in the 90s, which is perhaps way before your time, but in the 90s, after the Columbine shooting, a lot of people blamed Marilyn Manson for the shootings in Columbine, right? So they thought, well, they're listening to Marilyn Manson's music, and this kind of corrupted their minds. Now, it turns out that this is not the case. Marilyn Manson is not responsible for the Columbine shootings, but that still, you might think that if you're saturated in violent video games or violent music, maybe that's playing a role. That's not immediately clear, but that still seems to be something we would want to consider. We also might think about whether they've been indoctrinated in some sense. Maybe they've been, paying attention to a bunch of conspiracy theories online. Maybe it's a hate crime or it's some form of terrorism. And so we might think that plays an important role as a causal factor for why they did what they did. Or we might think that there's some sort of mental illness that's involved. It turns out that that's actually a really important issue that we should consider, especially with regard to gun control, right? So a lot of times, the people who are committing these kind of mass murders have some form of mental illness. Now, again, we need to be careful here because the mere fact that somebody might be experiencing a mental illness of some form does not mean by any means that they're going to go and commit some mass murder. Nonetheless, it does seem like an important issue that we should consider. And in order to see why, I want to draw your attention to a very famous example of these sort of mass murders, one that happened way before your time. It happened before I was alive. And this is an example of Charles Joseph Whitman, who's known as the Austin, Texas clock tower sniper. So Whitman in 1966 killed his mother and wife, and then he went to the University of Texas in Austin and killed 3 more people before he then climbed the clock tower on campus. And for over an hour, I think for like 90 minutes or so, he was randomly shooting at different individuals, students, faculty members, whoever he could find. He ended up killing a total of 16 people and injuring like 31 people. So this is kind of a very old example, but it turns out that it's going to help us think about how mental illness or different biological features that are kind of going on in the background actually do play an important role in figuring out whether or not we can hold people morally responsible for their actions, whether they could have done something other than what they were actually doing. It turns out for Whitman that he lived a very normal life up until just before these events took place. Right, he had a very normal upbringing. He was a good college student, had a decent marriage. He was a Marine. And just prior to these events, though, things started to change. Some folks started noticing that his personality changed to some extent. He seemed to be kind of a different person. He seemed to be undergoing kind of a psychological stress. Now, it turns out that that Whitman was shot on scene, and then after his death, during the autopsy, it was discovered that he had a brain tumor the size of a pecan. And that particular tumor was pressing against his amygdala, which, if you're not aware, there's a part of the brain related to things like anxiety, the fight or flight response, but really importantly, the part of the nervous system, part of the brain that we typically associate with being able to understand the difference between right and wrong, kind of having empathy or sympathy. These are very important parts of our brain that if they're going to be damaged in some sense, then we would not be able to make rational choices as most people would. And so as a result, some have theorized that if the tumor had been removed, then Whitman might not have committed the mass murder. Right? So this, in fact, raises a really important question for us. To what extent should we consider Whitman morally responsible for his actions if his decisions were not entirely under his control? A part of what he decided to do was the direct result of the tumor pressing on the amygdala, that part of the brain responsible for making these sorts of choices. So if we're going to accept that a major part of what caused Whitman's actions, in fact, was the tumor, then to what degree should we hold him morally responsible for these crimes? That's our question. Now, this raises an interesting distinction that you may have heard of. This is the distinction between nature and nurture, or sometimes people try to put it in terms of nature versus nurture. But the basic idea is, well, we're not responsible for our nature, right? I'm not responsible for my genetic makeup. I did not choose to be a middle-aged white male. I did not choose to have blue eyes, right? I was born with these features. Likewise, if you're a male or female or something else, you didn't really choose that. If you're gay or straight or something else, you didn't choose that. These are parts of your genetic makeup, and it's at least partly going to determine, who you grow up to be, right? So we're not responsible for these features, these biological features of who we are. So if most or maybe all of our choices are at least partly determined by things like our genes, our biology, our nature, then do we really even have a choice? If our choices are determined by these things, by our genes and our biology, then can we really praise or blame people for what we do? Right? Just think about somebody who is, someone who you would consider to be gorgeous. They're very, very attractive, very beautiful. Are they responsible for that? Right? Are they responsible for the genes they have? It seems like that's probably not the case. Now, it also turns out that our environment plays a really crucial role as well. Our environment at least partly determines our choices, the things that we do. We did not choose what family we were born into, our social or cultural situation, right? I was raised by, two heterosexual parents in Kansas City, Kansas. I did not choose that. It wasn't a choice I made, right? I grew up in a Catholic family. I didn't choose that. Maybe I make different choices with regard to my family or my religious situation later on in life, but at least when I'm born, I'm not like making any choice at all. These are parts of my environment, my social and cultural situation. So if it turns out that I'm not responsible for these environmental factors, then how could I be blamed or praised for anything that I choose to do? It looks like I don't really have a choice in that regard. Now, I think we should be careful here, right? The distinction between nature versus nurture is probably too simplistic. Perhaps a better way of thinking about this kind of distinction, which you may already be familiar with to some extent, maybe a better way to think about this is that it's actually a complex conjunction of both things, right? It's an interconnected or interdependent sort of relation between these factors. I think this quote here with the mountains in the background is really nice. Says, in the real world, there is no nature versus nurture argument, only an infinitely complex and moment by moment interaction between genetic and environmental effects. I think that's kind of a nice way to put it. But notice that that's not going to help us at all, right? The fact that we have to combine nature and nurture instead of thinking about it in terms of nature versus nurture, that's not going to help because, we're not going to be responsible for either of those things. We didn't choose our genetic biology. We did not choose our environmental situation. And if we're not responsible for the things we do, it looks like this is going to be a really, really dire situation. We generally think we can reasonably hold people morally responsible for their choices. However, if determinism is true, if it's false to say that people have alternative possibilities in front of them, if it's just false that they could have done otherwise, then it turns out that we can't reasonably hold people accountable for their actions. And that seems really deeply problematic.